It was about a hero who insisted with every breath that he was anything but a hero. Hi everyone, welcome to the Wheel of Mind, the Wheel of Time point of view reread podcast. This season we've been reading Matt Cawthon's perspective. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 45, our final Matt read-along episode in this season. I'm your co-host, Lajara Dane of the White Aja.
Hi, and I'm Giskel Simaris, a scholar from Ilion. For any new listeners to our series, I want to remind you that The Wheel of Mind is an in-depth character reread podcast, so this is your only spoiler warning. We may drop hints and spoilers from any book of the series at any time. Now today we're examining chapters 39, 40, 43, 45, 46, and the epilogue from A Memory of Light. But don't despair, many of these are small points of view.
And I'll get us started with Matt's perspective from Chapter 39, Those Who Fight. This chapter picks up with Rand gaining strength in his confrontation against the Dark One just after Demandred fell to Lan. Matt is still leading the forces of the light against the much larger Trolloc army. He feels a strange darkness in his head, and the reader realizes around the same time that he's taking this quick break from the fight, the Dark One is threatening to kill him. He resists cries that they need to retreat. Despite the overwhelming odds of this battle, he could pull it off with a winning toss of the dice. And that's exactly what happens. Rand's voice echoes over the battlefield, freezing the fighting just as Lan arose, clutching Demandred's head. He still fights. Just then, Oliver blew the horn of Valir. Matt uses the moment of stunned silence to order a charge at the Trollocs. He realizes he must have been unbound from the horn when he died in Rhuidean. Narishma heals Lan, who fainted just after he got up with his big resurrection act, but Matt is now chilled by a frightening thought. Which side blew the horn? He will find out soon as Arthur Hawkwing and the rest of the heroes approach. One of their number, who Matt cannot recognize, streaks away. Could he defeat Hawkwing if he had to, he thinks as he holds his Ashandari? Could anyone? Hawkwing breaks the silence as he and the other heroes quickly disabuse Matt of the following misconceptions. 1. They would not fight for just anyone. They require the dragon and his banner. 2. It was not Matt's hanging in Rhuidean that broke his link to the horn, but actually a different time that he died and doesn't remember it. 3. He needs to be incredibly grateful because the dragon saved him both times. He owes each breath to Rand, and he's been a pretty bad friend. 4. He and the rest of the forces of the light are not finished fighting. The heroes of the horn can't do it alone because they could be wounded or bound and thus defeated even though they're immortal. Okay, got it, Matt says. But that leaves one issue. Who blew the horn? The point of view switches to Oliver to answer that question. He's being clawed at by Trollocs, who eventually grab the horn from him, until a hero, Noel, rescues him. And thus ends Chapter 39, Those Who Fight.
Oh, this is one of those that is nestled in among so many other terrible things that are happening to catch up the readers to what else is going on in the story at this point. Again, it looks like Lan had fallen until we see him get up from Matt's point of view. We see that Elaine had been captured, Brigitte killed until the horn blows. And so many things are happening at this point. What we've discovered is from the chapter 37, the last battle, where it looked like things were on the precipice of disaster. We found it wasn't there yet. Things got a little bit worse and a little bit worse. And now when it looks like it's all hopeless and all falling apart, that's when everything turns around. So this is the chapter we've all been waiting for, and we love seeing even the bits of it through Matt's point of view. So now the horn's been blown, and Brigitte stands back up and rescues Elaine, and other people discover she's not dead. Now we see Matt's forces that are just in disarray because it's in bits and pieces of leftover armies that have just come back together under his leadership. And they have the Ogier, they have the Borderlanders, they have Tam Althor and some of the Two Rivers people, but it's Dragon Sworn, just people from different areas that have nowhere else to gather. Their leaders are dead. And so they gather together into this one force to try to retake the heights again. And it looks impossible. It looks like it can't be done. They're outnumbered 3-1 or 4-1. But this is the roll of the dice, as Matt said, that he had been waiting on. This is the change that marks the turning point. With Demandred dead, there's no one to counter Matt's prowess as a general. And he doesn't really have to direct the troops at this point. He's already gotten everything in place. Mm-hmm. It was ready. He was ready to pull this off. And so I love the genius of the move that even had Matt died right before this, things would have kept going forward because he had all his chess pieces, so to speak, in place. And there was really no way to stop it. It was natural at this point that if they got that opening, everything on his forces would start doing what they needed to do without guidance, without directions, because they were already placed exactly where they needed to be. He was just waiting for this miracle, waiting for something to change, even though he didn't know what it was.
Right. He still had hope for something, and he has benefited so many times from just chance throwing him something. Throwing him a miracle, as you put it. And so more than anybody like Arganda or any of these other seasoned fighters, he not only has all this battle prowess, but which might make him look at this as a hopeless situation like it does for most people. He's got his relationship to luck, and he's got that inclination as a gambler where he is going to try anyway, right? Even when the chips are down. Right. He is still going to play another hand. He still thinks there's just one other thing kind of waiting on the horizon. And for many people, that leads to a gambling addiction. Matt is just very, very lucky that the pattern kind of picked him up and spun him into a different direction so that his gambling instinct was a good thing here, where he had hope for something on the horizon. He just needed one more element to change pretty drastically, but that all these other pieces he had set up, like you put it, would start to really fall into place. He could see the end point of the victory, and he could see many of the roads to get there, but there's just kind of one obstacle here. And Lan took out the biggest one there. That was the biggest one. Yes. And then the morale boost of seeing that Lan is still alive is kind of what... I guess allowed them to kind of squeeze every drop out of Demandred's death that they could. So Rand really came through for him there. And I just like how Matt not only had this hope, but he had this tenacity. Even before Lan was standing up, even before the horn was blown, Arganda thought everything was lost and they should retreat, but Matt was willing to give it his all. And like you said last week, there's nowhere to retreat anyway, and nobody to surrender to. So Matt goes all in, and that's kind of what we're proud of him for doing, because this was exactly the moment to do that.
Right. And you have equated this several different times to the movie Signs, the Mel Gibson movie, where the alien invasion and all of these little things had to be perfectly aligned for everything to come together at the end. And what we saw as being problems, the little girl having this nervous tic about water, and the boy having asthma, and all these things that they saw as terrible things in their lives were necessary. And you see something similar here, and I think that's why that's been such a good analogy, because on that movie we could see it all come together. Mm-hmm. And in this book, you can visualize that and picture it in your mind, all these different pieces coming together. That Matt... It's almost like he had an instinct. Okay, we need to be ready. I don't know what's going to happen, but something's going to happen. And every little thing had to be in place. Egwene had to be willing to be a hero and sacrifice herself. Mm-hmm. Lan had to be willing to die. Though he lived, he was willing to die in order to not win a sword fight, but to kill Demandred. Yeah. And, that's one of those things I still get chills over that face off between those two. Just so much sacrifice. Brigitte dying for Elaine. All of these things that really had to happen this way. And you see that it's almost as if not just that Matt has the luck to pull this off, but the pattern, the creator had everything lined up, and Matt he keeps falling into what needs to happen and calling it luck.
Yeah, so that his exact quirks are exactly what are needed here.
Right. He has this instinct, but no knowledge of it. He doesn't know exactly what needs to happen, but he knows where everything needs to be so it can happen. And I just love that when you see it all come together and everything turns when it looks so hopeless. And to me, that's part of a great story. Any great story, any great drama is to make it look hopeless and helpless, but they never ever gave up. As you said, the tenacity of Matt, kept them where they needed to be, instead of little groups trying to slink off and get away in the distance and just live for a few more days or whatever, and not standing and fighting. Now I do enjoy the bits at I guess the revelations you should say that Hawkwind gave to Matt. I thought they were good. That they would not fight for just anyone, but instead had to be under the sign of the banner and for the dragon. And that's when I totally missed my first read through. And in fact, until we studied for this, I don't think it really clicked home with me. I had often wondered why the Horn of Valir was hidden in the Eye of the World. And I've even heard and read some people say, really the whole thing about the Eye of the World was, it was kind of useless. You had all this giant reservoir of power, and some untrained kid uses it to kill a Forsaken, but there's really nothing that momentous that was done with that power. Not like you would expect there to have been in a story this epic. But if nothing else, it hid the Horn of Valir and the Dragon Banner, and those two things had to be tied together. And I don't know that I had really put that together before. If the horn had been anywhere else, someone else might have found it, decided, well, it's not really the Horn of Valir. See, nothing happens, because without the banner and the dragon, they wouldn't come and fight. They would have been melted down years ago, or stuck in a museum somewhere or something.
That's a fantastic point that I never thought of either. Anything that seems like it doesn't fit in the Eye of the World with the rest of the series, I always use meta novel explanations for that and go, well, maybe he didn't know if he would get his trilogy he had signed on for, actually approved when he was writing the first draft of Eye of the World. Maybe he thought it would be good to have, something that seems like the end of the series if you don't get to write the rest of the books or whatever. So that's kind of... there's a lot of Eye of the World isms that don't survive the rest of the series and don't seem very coherent with it. And so I just would have assumed it was one of those. I'm like, the Eye of the World was kind of a strange ending because it doesn't seem to matter. But it super mattered with the horn and the banner, and I haven't really thought much about that. Speaking of the banner, though, it was actually in last episode's readings where Matt decided that they get it out and raise it for some reason. He thought it would be a good way to kind of rally all of these people who had been kind of losing heads of their armies to being beside just this one side of the light. And I forgot to bring it up last week, but I'm glad we're talking about the banner and the horn now, because it made me so it made me feel so good for Matt's character development in terms of how he has treated Rand in the past. He's being made to reflect on that in this episode's readings, but when he raised that banner, that's when Matt first shunned Rand, was when Rand showed them the banner, and explained to them who Moiraine said that he was and what Moiraine said that he was. And that's all I could think of was that scene where he unfurled it around the campfire for Matt and Perrin, and Matt just never wanted to have anything to do with him again after that.
Right. Exactly. It's been so difficult to see their friendship. We've talked about that different times throughout the series.
So sad.
The aspects of the strain on their friendship, and that is where it really fell apart. You're right.
And so it's like a little piece of Matt's working to repair that. I don't think he realized it at the time, but it was one of those little kind of symbols, in the same way that Sanderson was seeding all those, hey, remember, there's got to be a confrontation with Padon Fane signals that we've been talking about. I think the banner was almost like a, hey, he needs to come through for Rand when he's been avoiding him this whole time. That's kind of how I saw it.
That is sort of a sign of the repair of their friendship, but still Hawkwind and them pointed out to him, you've been a terrible friend. You just have.
Yeah.
You owe every breath to him that you have, because you've died twice and he's rescued you from that both times. So, they've definitely cleared that up. I like that it didn't leave the loose ends hanging. I have wondered aloud on this podcast which death it was that released Matt from the Horn of Valir. Well,
Oh yeah, we had sort of debated it. I forgot too that they do.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's right there in black and white. But there are so many details like this that you miss in this series. I think you could go through it dozens of times and still be surprised occasionally. That's all I've got on that one. Chapter 40 is entitled Wolf Brother because it does begin with some very significant things in Perrin's story arc. But we skipped ahead to Matt's point of view, where he led his ragtag army, all that was left of a dozen armies, to do the only thing that they could do when outnumbered this badly. They attacked. Matt had never been this proud in any of his ancient war memories. With Demandred dead and the Sharan channelers gone, they finally had a chance, and the momentum was theirs, even if the numbers were still against them. So they pushed with everything that they had, trying to push the enemy off of the heights and into the Trolloc armies below that were still facing Elaine's army. That ought to get them all tangled up. And just when it seemed that it could not be enough to do the job, Tenna shouted and told him to look south. There were strange lights in the sky. Huge gateways stood open in the night sky, and tow-rocken were flying through, carrying lanterns, followed by those crazy light shows that the Damane loved to put on. The ground shook with the sound of marching feet, and arrows began falling into the enemy ranks. The Seanchan had returned to the battle. Then more unexpected gateways opened, facing the enemy armies, and Talmanas and the band began firing dragons through those open gateways into the enemy ranks. Finally, the gamble was paying off. Most of the pieces of Matt's plan were falling into place. Just one more big piece left. And then chapter 40 ends with Jer Grady's point of view as he sat mulling over the crazy orders he had been given. He was to stay there and stay hidden until dawn. Well, dawn was almost here, and he was ready to make his last stand when he suddenly saw the 100 soldiers and 500 villagers from that little place called Hinderstap, who had been slaughtered the day before, rise to life again and turn around and kill the startled Trollocs and Dreadlords.
Wow. So just like you were saying when we discussed our last reading, all of the pieces are really falling into place here. We're starting to see that, and we see it finish in the next chapter, I think. People are playing their parts appropriately. Matt just set it up. He's not having to direct anything anymore. But the only thing I have to add to this discussion, I think that I didn't say with our last chapter, is that I like that there's no Deus Ex Machina here to save the day in this story in the way that there could have been. So the fact that there's still hard fighting, the fact that the heroes of the Horn don't just automatically win the battle, they can be defeated. Demandred falling didn't just make all the Shadowspawn fall. They weren't linked to him like a Game of Thrones final villain.
Right.
You don't just kill him and then the rest of them fall or melt or whatever. And so you still need everybody pulling their weight, and you need it perfectly timed. So it was just cool to see that start to pay off. The Seanchan coming through, the Hinderstap villagers coming through, and restoring the flow of that river. Elaine's apparent resurrection because everybody thought she was dead. So yeah, they're able to just pull off this victory because all the pieces are in place. It ends up being a pretty sound one on the fields of Merrilor, but it still had to be pulled off correctly. If any of these pieces had gone wrong, they wouldn't have been able to do it in this way. Not only does this novel have an ending that still makes the struggle feel worth it and not kind of cheap or some kind of unearned victory, the light itself in the story has a coherent leadership, and that's what the shadow doesn't have anymore. And they have people willing to sacrifice themselves for this ideal and for the side of the light, which the shadow doesn't have. Everybody's selfish, and that's why their lack of leadership isn't going to allow things like Demandred's battle plans to just continue playing out, right, in the way that Matt's would if he had fallen.
Right.
And the thing that I like about Matt that I can pull out of this is that he does have his magical ancient battle knowledge, but it's not like he's winning this battle through some kind of unearned easy privilege or anything. He still had to use his own intelligence and exercise that to problem solve using the knowledge that he has. So yeah, he gained that knowledge not through his personal experiences, but he still had to draw on it effectively in the moment, which not just anybody with this infusion of memories could have done, I think. He thought through all these possibilities ahead of time in order to use the terrain appropriately and use the unique features of each of the light's forces to their advantage to understand where they should be placed. So I like that Matt pulled this off. I think he's very intelligent, and I love that it feels earned.
Yes. Oh, I agree. And that's a wonderful way to put it. Because none of this, even though everything fell into place, I should say, none of it fell into place without the effort, without the sacrifice, without the
Yeah.
struggle. Because those things are part of what makes this so epic and so real, so realistic. It's just that, you know, you don't see, like, as much as I love the Lord of the Rings, the movie when Sauron falls, the ground caves in and all of his forces are basically consumed in the earthquake.
Oh, yeah.
None of the good guys are. Things like that. That it's too clean cut an ending, even though there is plenty of sacrifice and things to go around in that series. Here there is no magic anything that's just going to save the day without more sacrifice, without more giving, without it hurting all the way to the end and continuing to hurt even after you win. Because that's how real life is. Anytime people are struggle in any type of conflict, whether it's something in their personal life, whether it's nations struggling in conflict, even when it's over, there's still a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, a lot of things that have to be built up again later. And you get a sense of that even though at the end of the story the forces of light win, there is a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of graves to be dug. There are so many things to be rebuilt. I mean, the entire city of Camlin is still in rubble. Nothing magically changes all of that. So, and just something else to love about the series, that
Yeah.
it lends it so much credibility. And as far as what we're faced with here, we get to see more good guys come onto the field, but again, it's not unexpected because the signal had already been sent. Here they sent the message to Tuon. Yes, it's time to come back into the battle. He didn't know exactly what moment in which it was going to happen, but it was not totally unexpected. The reader doesn't get this sense of a MacGuffin that just comes in and, oh wow, we never saw this coming. This is totally out of left field. We didn't expect all of these guys to step back into the field magically. But it's just the timing that was so perfect here, and it. I mean, you just want to stand up and cheer when the Xiantian show up, which is something we never would have guessed. 3 books into this series, we never could have seen them as the good guys or as someone who would come in and save the day. And they didn't by themselves, but they were part of what saved the day. They were part of the ones who stood in the gap and fought against total darkness. So, yeah, I like that. And I know I threw in the part about Jur Grady's point of view, even though this is a Matt point of view reread.
Yeah.
That is still one of my favorite elements of this show, and
Oh,
it's
yeah.
something that Matt set up. So he's very invested in this, and I felt like it was appropriate.
Indeed, I agreed. And I've been integrating some of the other points of view as well, where appropriate, like little bits of Oliver's and stuff like that, which,
Totally.
especially in these later chapters, you get a lot of flashing very rapidly back and forth between short perspectives. And
Right.
so it just makes for a disjointed summary experience if you don't include those bridges anyway. Did you have any more thoughts on this
Oh,
chapter?
no, thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and summarize Chapter 43, A Field of Glass, which begins with Logain deciding to make his way to where Egwene had made her big sacrifice to retrieve an Angreal. Then we enter Matt's point of view as he rides among the heroes of the Horn with a special place among them. But does that mean no? According to Hend the Striker, Matt, although heroic, was mysteriously not chosen to be a hero of the Horn. Whew, good. Matt does not like the idea of being at the beck and call of whoever blows that horn in the future. On the fields of Merrilor, all the dominoes we have seen Matt set up over the last few episodes and chapters start to fall. In fact, he no longer had to direct troop movements. He had to simply wait for all the appropriately placed pieces to play out as expected. The Shanchan army joined with Elaine's forces, and the River Mora started running again to divide the Shadow's forces. Across the river, the Shanchan army sent out their own trained and domesticated monsters as their vanguard, and that side of the river became choked with Trollocs piling on top of each other trying to escape. Talmanis and Eludra fired the dragons at those piles of Trollocs just to make sure that very few could escape, and very few did escape. The struggle against them was over rather quickly. Mat then asks Archer Hawkwing whether it's over. Yes, on the fields of Merrilor, but, judging by the weird clouds and the continued earthquakes, not so much at Thakandar and Shayol Ghul. Mat suspected as much, and he felt Tavir and Twisting drawing him there along with some unacknowledged guilt. He rode off to find a way to Rand, into whose point of view the chapter now switches. He is continuing to confront the Dark One, appearing to gain some ground. And then next, we find an injured Avienda in Thakandar confronting Graendal, or Hessalam, as she's now called, for a final time as they jump through a gateway together. And thus ends chapter 43, A Field of Glass.
I didn't mention this earlier, though they were introduced in one of the segments we covered a bit ago. But I love the way they use the dragons in this part of it. During my reread, I remember how, or I just messed that up totally. During my first read through of the story, I remember how they had taken many of the dragons to this cave hidden under Merrilor, or at least under the heights, and they were trying to repair them. And I didn't really understand what was going on. I kept wondering, when they were going to open a gateway and bring them out. And then I love the fact they didn't bring them out.
So clever.
Yes, that was such an awesome use of them. And I tend to think this idea probably came about after Mat had seen how the gateways could be used to view the battlefield. You would just project a gateway on top of a table.
Yeah.
And look down at the battlefield to see what's going on and how they had revolutionized warfare. And they even started passing messages back and forth. We had the Zoom meeting between Egwene and the Empress, just through using gateways. So, as they develop different ideas, different ways to use them, I can't help but think that triggered Mat to say, we can use the dragons this way. And I love that. Now, realistically, firing them inside of a cave, there's no amount of wax you could put in your ears that would save your hearing. And they're opening a gateway to allow in fresh air would probably not be sufficient to clear the smoke from black powder. But it's still an awesome story, and I love that element of it. Of just, you open a gateway, boom, you destroy enemy forces, you close the gateway. And they're not having to move the dragons every time and all of that. So that is just, and I imagine in my mind, they may have even said it in the story, they're in the cave, they probably had one gateway open above the field looking down so they would know where to open the next ones.
Oh, yeah, that would make sense.
And so they're watching like from above and then, open up windows here, here, and here. So, yeah, that was just such an awesome use of I keep wanting to say technology, but I guess the technology of the one power. Yeah. Because one thing we've noticed throughout the Wheel of Time series, and we've commented on it and other people have as well, is that the Aes Sedai had become very unimaginative in their uses of the power. Mm-hmm. And we see that when the Aes Sedai forces are fighting, they're still throwing fireballs, weaves of air, binding people up. They never think outside those boxes. It's like they've been trained to use the power certain ways, and they've been trained to do it for so many years, and they've passed this down for so many centuries that they never think to try anything new. They never do anything innovative. And what we see are our heroes coming in, the Aemon Fielders and others who have not spent so much time saturated in that culture, who come up with the innovations, who come up with the new ideas, breaking out of the stagnation of having done things a certain way. And I picked on the Aes Sedai with that, but you even see that among the Seanchan. The Seanchan did everything the same way until, they got Mat involved and other people here, I'm going to just call them our heroes, where they started finding out new things and discovering other ways of doing things. And that's one thing that gives me hope for the advancement of their culture at some point in time in the future, just because they are starting to break out of their stagnation too, of this static way of thinking that doesn't allow for innovation, does not allow for freedom of thought, and really it holds back all of society. Now, I do have one question that I had never thought of until you said it in your summary, that Mat was not chosen to be a hero of the Horn. So I ask you, how do they choose who gets to be a hero of the Horn or not?
I do not know.
Me
So,
either, which is why I posed it to you, because I didn't have a
yeah.
clue.
Hend, the striker here, seems to have no clue why Matt wouldn't have been chosen, but Arthur Hawkwing in The Great Hunt tells Huron, the sniffer, that he may end up among them, that he's done so well. So Arthur seemed to know that Huron might end up being among their number soon. So I wonder if only Arthur knows, if he was just kind of guessing to make this guy feel good. I don't know what was going on there. I don't know, but it sounded like you had a thought there. What were you thinking about this?
Not a serious thought, but I just pictured
Oh,
in my mind, Hawkwing and many of the other heroes of the Horn gathered there in Tel Riyadh, and him saying, "Okay, who votes for Matt Cawthon? I, if you agree to allow him, and nobody says anything. You just get tumbleweeds.
yeah, yeah, and I really love that idea.
Here's Noel. Here's Noel who died in another universe. I vote for Noel." And so he's accepted in. So
Yep, and Hend is just not allowed to talk about it. That's why he said, "I don't know." That's their oath.
right.
What I took out of this chapter was I was curious about that too, but didn't have really a coherent answer. I was also interested in Matt seeming to feel guilt, which is a little bit unlike him, as
Yes.
we know.
Right.
He not only feels this Taviran tug towards Rand, but he does seem to feel guilt that he classically denies. I mean, that's really his thing. After Amoresu's words to him in chapter 39 about how much he owes to the dragon and how bad of a friend he's been to him, Matt thinks consciously in this chapter to himself that he had been a good friend when he could, and anybody would be scared and keep their distance when madness was involved, right? So he moves from a flat out denial, this flat out lie of, "Oh, I've been a good friend." Then he
Right.
starts qualifying it. Well, some when I could. And then he goes into excuses. Well, anybody would be touchy around the madness. So
Right.
typical of Matt, we see progression in his thoughts towards a better, more altruistic kind of action, towards doing the right thing, but we don't see the conclusion happen in his thoughts. He never quite gets there. So instead, his body acts out the conclusion as he often does. And so I loved getting to see that classic Matt formula applied here in a way that I've had really been waiting for, and I'd been really sad about their friendship. So seeing that he's going to pull through for Rand was really important to me. So although Merrilor is one, he's got to ride towards Shayol Ghul, or at least at this point, he's going to somebody who can get him there to help his friend. So Matt has grown a lot. He's learned to accept a lot of things, but he's still the same old Matt in a lot of ways. He still concludes his thoughts with a seemingly impulsive, embodied, heroic action, and that's exactly who we needed him to be in this moment, who the world needed him to be in this moment to save the day. So, yeah, this seemed pretty pivotal. Matt feeling guilty about something and then acting on it.
Again, we've seen so much progression, so much growth with Matt, but at the end of the day, still a lot of the same old Matt there, and you can typically count on that. So, okay. Well, if you don't have anything else, I'll move us forward with chapter 45, Tendrils of Mist.
Sounds good.
Matt stood with Noel, Oliver, and Grady. Wow, Noel, a hero of the Horn. Who would have believed it? Matt commended Grady on the good work he had done upriver, something that Grady both wanted to understand and at the same time was afraid to talk about. But no time for that now anyway. Matt needed a gateway to Shayol Ghul. It seemed that Rand needed him there now. No can do, Matt. Gateways won't work there now. Something weird is going on. The closest they could get was that Xianshan patrol camp about a day's ride away from there. Then, the next time in this chapter, when we get to see out of Matt's eyes, he's trying to hold on to his hat and his sanity as the wind whips at him fiercely from the back of a Torakan. Oliver was with him and laughing with delight, something Matt blamed on the fear and the lack of oxygen up so high. Who could be crazy enough to actually ride these things? Not Matt. Well, at least not after this ride was over. Matt got a quick overview of the battlefield here as the riders circled, looking for a safe place to land. It looked bad. Bands of Aiel were fighting each other all over the place. Trollocs had broken through the fortifications. Dark hounds were taking down men at an alarming rate, and there was a strange silvery mist swirling around that Matt could feel. It was Mashadar. It was familiar to him, yet different somehow. He could feel that Padon Fane and the dagger were both there, though. Just then a flight of arrows hit the tow rocket, and one of them grazed the handler's head. Matt unbuckled himself from the flimsy straps, grabbed the reins, and did his best to guide the beast to a landing. They crashed. Matt was whole after the crash, but wobbly, and quickly unbuckled Oliver, who looked dazed. And here's a quote. "Matt," Oliver said, "next time I think you should let me fly it. I don't think you did a very good job." End quote. Matt was panicked that he had dropped the banner, and he could not find it in the wreckage in confusion. Oliver pointed up to the top of the mountain, where the white and black clouds swirled around into the familiar Aes Sedai pattern. Oliver smiled. Again, this is a quote. Oliver smiled, looking up at the sign made by the swirling clouds. "It'll be fine. We're beneath his banner already," he said, then lifted the horn and blew a beautiful note. End quote.
That was really touching there at the end, for sure. I thought the whole tow rockin' ride was really hilarious.
Yes.
But as far as my notes and what I was able to pull out of this chapter was a little bit more of a serious note from the beginning of Matt's first point of view in this chapter. And it's a little bit about what we just talked about with our previous chapter. While Matt is reflecting on Noel having rescued Oliver, he's thinking about how Noel might enjoy it, but Matt wouldn't dance at another man's command. Not for immortality itself. No, he wouldn't. Referring to Noel now being a hero of the Horn, of course.
Right.
And I have seen some people point this out, despite what the heroes just told him in the last chapter, that this might be the typical dramatic irony we find in Matt's point of view, meaning that he actually will eventually be chosen as a hero of the Horn, although he's not yet been included. And I really hope that that's not the case. So in my headcanon, it doesn't mean that. This is one of Matt's few genuine thoughts that isn't just set to blow up in his face later for a plot point. I think that because he's been under somebody's thumb the whole series, whether it's just being ta'veren, dealing with the Finn, the Aes Sedai, I have just been rooting for him at this point, wanting him to finally be free from all that. So I think I see him getting sort of reincarnated as a different gambler figure. He's still going to be heroic, but maybe in other lives it might be in a less world-changing way, in a little more of a mundane, heroic way, like Suan's uncle Huan, who died in the burning building saving the children. So I think in whatever form he's in the future, Matt will be there when the flames are high, but he's going to do it on his terms, not somebody else's, not somebody blowing a horn, not the pattern anymore. I just hope for him that he gets to retire from all of that.
Right. Yeah, you would like to think that. You'd like to think he's earned his way, and he's still going to be under Fortuana's thumb for quite some time. We hope
that's true.
Least.
That's enough to deal with. I hope.
Yes.
I hope then, especially that he doesn't become
Right.
a hero of the Horn.
But Matt does not want to be at anyone's beck and call. And as well, there's another quality you have to be one of the returned heroes of the Horn, and that is you have to be dead. And Matt does not want to be a hero.
Exactly.
The heroes are
there
dead. The heroes very rarely ever live. So. Yeah, again, that's a state that he's just not ready for yet. He's got a lot of living left to do, because you have to say this about Matt. He does enjoy life. I mean, he complains about things. He is the whiner in chief many times. It seems that nothing is ever quite good enough. You can't have enough lace or whatever. There's all of these things that he claims to not like. But at the end of the day, in whatever situation he finds himself, Matt finds some way to enjoy it. Even the complaining, I think he enjoys complaining. And so he's finding some way to enjoy the situation he's in. Matt is just one of those people who loves life, and he's gonna have fun. And if that gets him in trouble, fine, we'll just be in trouble because we're gonna have fun. So I do admire that about him in many ways, even though as a friend, he would be very frustrating to deal with. But um, yeah, he's a fun character. So yeah, let him enjoy life as long as he can. Let him live to be 120, and finally pass away while cracking a joke at someone. But let him go out on his own terms.
Yeah. Chapter 46 is called To Awaken, and it picks up right after the tow rockin' crash, where Matt puts Oliver on a horse with Noel, and the heroes help cut a path through Trollocs so that Matt can reach the dragon's defenders outside Shayol Ghul. The wild hunt is pouring into the valley, and the defenders don't stand a chance against them, even the Aiel. Not only is this group of dark hounds doing a number on the side of the light, but the foggy tendrils of Mashadar are creeping up towards Rand. Not a soul is able to withstand its determined climb. But it looks like somebody is faring well against the Darkhounds at least. And yes, it's that fool Perrin. It would be. Somehow, when Perrin smashes those hounds with his hammer, they stay down. Perrin seems confused as to why Matt would be here, though, saying he can't fight Darkhounds, and Matt confesses it wasn't him who blew the horn, and he has to admit he has no news of Fael, who had given the horn to Oliver. Though he doesn't seem to believe it himself, he concedes to Perrin that it doesn't mean for sure that she's died. She could still be alive out there somewhere. Matt explains that he's here for Padon Fane, who brought Mashadar, and warns him not to touch the mist. Perrin has a score to settle with that guy. Oh, and you think I don't? Matt retorts. Chapter 46, To Awaken, then ends with Matt and Perrin gaping at the tendril of mist extending through Matt's chest.
This is another one of those chilling chapters that you get there, or sections within the chapter. Um, Again, we've left one battlefield that had been hopeless, and yet things turned around. Now we come to another where we have two elements that make this one hopeless. It's not just all the Trollocs and the red veiled Aiel that are such a challenge. You can see our heroes surviving that. But the mist and the dark hounds, those are two things that nobody has a defense for unless you're Taverin and had to have a magic hammer that some Asha men and some wise women or wise ones helped you create. And they did it without even really knowing how they were doing it. It just felt right. It's always one of those great excuses when someone doesn't know what they're doing with great power. Well, it just
Yeah.
felt like the right thing to do. So, yeah, if you're Perrin, yeah, and you're Taverin, and that falls together for you, okay, now you've got one defense against these. Or if you're Matt, who happened to have touched a dagger that you weren't supposed to and then lied about it for a while until almost dying, then maybe you have a defense here. But still, even with those things, when I hit that point, especially my first reread, and Matt's standing there and looks down, there's this tendril of mist coming out of his chest. It's already gone through him. And in your mind, you're just saying, Matt's dead. There's no way out of this one. The dice has finally stopped for Matchroom Cawthon. But luckily, yeah, we discover that's not the case. And we'll get into that in the next segment here. But I think all of our listeners are fairly comfortably aware of what happens here. So
True.
yeah, again, it's a pivotal chapter. We haven't spent as much time here in the Valley of Thakandar from the points of view of what's going on. I mean, we have some. We've had some of Avienda's and parents and different people. And to me, this is a side note, I was never fully satisfied with Perrin's story arc, especially here at the end. It seemed to me like he should have played a bigger role, but he's just fiddling around in Teleron Riyadh, the Wolf Dream, back and forth between there and reality. Finally figured out how to move back and forth without needing a gateway, and it's like he's not really doing anything important until this moment when he starts fighting the Dark Hounds. Well, he was starting out with Lord Luke, and he was so focused on Luke and Slayer, that he'd shut out everything else. But yeah, became hyper focused on them, and then he starts in with the Dark Hounds, and he's got another role to play with Sindane / Lanfear, but I don't know. It seemed like he didn't play as big a role. everything that
Yeah.
happens to Rand, we can see a reason for it. Man, all this that happens with Matt, we see all these details and such good reasons for it. But I don't know, for some reason, Perrin's story arc here near the end, I find very dissatisfying. It's like I expected more out of him. And not. I guess I'm just that hard to please because it's such a good story. There's nothing I would change. There's just I don't know. I feel like there should have been something a little more heroic, but in Perrin's case, it was more dark and vengeful. So
Yes. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, and speaking of unsatisfying arcs, I used to think that what comes up next with Matt and Pat on Fane was a little anticlimactic or unsatisfying, but now I'm finding myself enjoying it a lot more on a read through
yes,
or on a reread, so I'm glad of that. I also think it's pretty funny that Perrin was like, "What are you doing here?" Like he's still, even
right,
though Matt has been commanding the forces for this whole battle, Perrin is still like, "Matt, that Joker can't possibly be doing anything heroic. Why in the world would he be here in the worst thick of it?"
right.
Um, but it kind of makes sense though that Perrin, because Perrin's been like unconscious for the entire last battle, I think. So
Right,
he may
right.
not be aware that Matt is commanding the forces of
I,
the light at this point.
I, I think at one point, when he comes out of the wolf dream and is so weak, Master Luhan kind of rescues him, takes him over to
Yeah.
the place where they take him to the healers in Mayin and all of that. That we think he's out of the battle entirely at that point. But he gets caught up in a few of the events, but I don't think he did in a face to face. So really, one of the last times he saw Matt, Perrin was getting ready to lead an army. Matt, I can't remember if he was on his way to Camlin or on his way away from there, back down to Ibu Dar. But that's
Mm.
when he throws acorns from behind a tree until he finally gets
Yeah.
Perrin's attention and has a
Yeah.
badger in a sack. They sit and talk for a few minutes, and
True.
Matt leads
That's a
him with
good
the
point.
badger. Yeah. So no wonder Perrin is like, "What are you doing here?" It's just he has more of that childhood image of Matt than
Yep.
anyone else would. So I can very well understand why Perrin would have that point of view because he's heard things about what Matt's doing, but the last he saw him, he was back to his old self again, or at least channeling that old self to a point that no one
Yeah.
would consider he may actually be good at his job and be very dangerous and be very, very, very necessary and useful.
That's a
Um,
great point. I did not consider what their last meeting was. So, yeah, totally feel you there.
yeah.
Um,
No, there may have been another one since then, but I can't remember it right off the top of my head. I think that was at least one of the last times that Perrin saw him.
yeah, that would make sense. Are you ready to move on to the epilogue now?
Yes, Epilogue.
Okay.
This is after Rand has worked his grand magic and the boar is not just sealed up, but the entire prison remade, and the light has won. Um, we come to many different points of view here in the epilogue, but one of those we see Matt after having stabbed Padon Fane with his own dagger. Matt grinned and watched the sun come out and burn away the mist. Uh, it was gone for good, seems like. Fane's body melted away into a foul, reeking mess, and Matt just left the dagger there to rot along with it. 3 steps away, he'd found his hat and began whistling as he strolled away. And somewhere in there, I couldn't find it today, he had given an explanation as to why the mist didn't kill him. It's like getting a disease. Once you've got it, you're immune to it. Then later, we catch it with Matt, later on in the epilogue, strolling into the Xianchan camp to the gasps of surprise from many passersby. He walks up to Tuan, who simply looked at him and asked, "Where have you been?" In response, Matt struck a grand pose with one hand pointing up to the sky. When nothing happened, he did it again, even higher, and suddenly fireworks went off in the distance. Quote, "The best bloody fireworks show in the history of my land or yours." End quote. Seemingly unimpressed, Tuon set off some fireworks of her own. It seems that she's pregnant. Now she could even kill Matt if she needs to. Quote, Matt felt his grin widen. Well, we'll have to see what we can work out. Tell me, do you ever play dice? End quote.
All right, there's kind of some really big moments packed into this pretty short point of view right here in the epilogue. So,
Oh, yes.
I mean, of course, we are proud of Matt for not having grabbed the dagger after he defeated Padon Fane.
Yes.
I don't know what would have happened if he touched it, since it melted right after he walked away. So I don't know if it could have really affected him in any way, but it was still just good for his character, I think, that he rejected it. So that was cool to see.
And I was a little unclear about, did the dagger actually melt, or did it just kind of get hidden in the goo of Padon Fane's melting body? I'll have to go back and reread that, because at first I thought the dagger melted, and then the next time through I'm like, well, when you read what it actually says, I almost expected him to pile some rocks over it or something so no one else would find it. But hopefully it did melt away. But whatever happens with the dagger, and hopefully the curse on it is completely gone anyway, what I love to see is Matt's response to it. Even though he's thought of it a few times, when Egwene mentioned it a couple of episodes back, he automatically reaches to his hip where it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't really want it, but he's thought of it a few times, and we know there's some amount of desire there. And we've seen how he's drawn toward rubies. We think that's an unconscious tie to the ruby hilted dagger. Yet he just walks away from it, and it was the right thing to do. And I love that. I love that Matt can see that, can understand that. Even though I might still want to have something to do with that, that is no good for me.
Yeah. We've already been reflecting, I think, on how much we have seen Matt's character grow in good ways by this point, and that's one example of it, is rejecting the dagger. Despite all this growth, he still has so many of his same goofy aspects, as we've also talked about.
Yes.
And so I think with the deep dive that we've done, we could have a lot of sort of fan fiction-y like ideas about what would come next for him, because even though we've seen him accept one aspect of his life and then move on and be in immediate denial of the next problem that pops up. So it's not like he has just learned to accept things right away. He still has this same knee-jerk reaction and lies to himself and etc. So it just makes me wonder what all kind of challenges fatherhood is going to bring up for him. He just seems kind of excited and happy about it, but I'm just imagining like Matt as a dad seems so wild to think about. Like, even though he just saved the world by leading the forces of the light and defeating Mashadar and all this stuff, I can't imagine him raising a child.
No.
I know he's gonna have to have a lot of help for sure, but it's a hilarious thought, and I could just see that this could be a big like character development track for him for sure.
Oh, yes. I mean, you talk about the dramatic irony of picturing in your mind Matt being not just a father, but the father to a moody teenager who is heiress to the empire. If he had a daughter,
Yeah.
that would be so hilarious. You could just imagine him at many points just throwing up his hands and walking away because he cannot deal with this. He cannot deal with the kind of person she's turning into. So there could be many moments like that you want to see it, and yet in a way you're like, no, we're better off leaving it alone. Let's just push that aside because nothing could live up to my expectations of that. So yeah, let's just leave it where it is in our minds and go no further with it, because I don't know that it could ever live up to the joy I have just at the mere thought of it.
Yeah.
And again, one little small tidbit in here, but just after he dealt with Padon Fane and he was watching things melt away, and 3 steps away he finds his hat. I love that. That's his, part of his signature look. Plops the hat back on his head and throws the Ashendara over his shoulder and starts whistling as he strolls away.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it brings me back to what I said earlier. Matt just loves life. He just destroyed Mashadar, turned its own evil upon it, so that had it grown much stronger, it would have gotten outside of Fane, and they couldn't have stopped it. But at this point, it's still tied to Padon Fane, and so by killing Fane with Mashadar's own evil, they kind of just killed all of it. And after something that big and that momentous, he doesn't look around and think, "Wow, I just saved everybody here." No, he starts whistling and walking, seeing seeing who he can find that's still left alive, and they can talk and celebrate and whatever else he's going to do. So he's just glad to be alive, gloriously alive. I was almost dead yesterday, maybe dead tomorrow, but today, gloriously alive.
Absolutely.
One thing about the epilogue that pains me, it really hurts me to see this, and it's not a Matt point of view, but it does concern Matt. When we see Loyal going from tent to tent, trying to find Matt, and he goes in and he checks in on Rand, and that's when we find out that Rand is dying, even though there's no wounds to heal. For some reason, he's dying, and Moradin is getting better, and people are talking about the irony of it. Loyal is wanting to get all the details he can from Matt, and work on his story. And we know Matt has just skipped out at the time. In fact, he's headed back to the Sion-Chan. That's it's where we get in between these two points of view that I read from. Is when we see that happen. But it's almost like I think he would have stayed and celebrated with Rand had Rand been survived things. But Matt could not be the kind of person to stay and watch Rand die. And it hurts me because I think it shows just how far their relationship healed and how much better it got. Had Rand died halfway through the series, when Matt was doing everything he could to avoid him. You remember how Matt seemed like he just couldn't stand the thought of Rand going crazy. And then when he found out Saidin had been cleansed, he was more open to being friends with Rand again and getting closer to him. But he couldn't. He just could not bring himself to stay there and watch his friend die, and that hurts me because in a way they're showing a lack of maturity, but in another way, it brings me back to their closeness that they had on the road to Camlin when it was just the two of them. I think I think Matt truly cared for him again. He had worked past all his other issues that were between he and Rand. And he couldn't bring himself to be there and watch it because I think it just hurt him too badly. So I would have liked to have seen him make that sacrifice for Rand, but at the same time, I can kind of see that's just not Matt's way. It's not how he deals with that kind of thing. And I think in my head canon he mourns Rand's death, but he just couldn't stay and watch it. He just couldn't be a part of that. So, again, we see a lot of growth, a lot of maturity, yet at the same time, growth and maturity does not change everything about who you are. There are still elements of your personality that are there to stay, and we see some of those elements with Matt. I think it breaks his heart, but he's not the kind of person to hang around just to make everyone else feel better. He probably made his peace and went on his way.
Yeah, I think so. We don't know Matt to be a very reverent kind of guy, so it really only makes sense that he would deal with that in his own way and not publicly at a funeral.
A lot of change, a lot of fun times, a lot of sad times, but man, I don't know that we can ever top this season. I mean, of the Wheel of Mind. Now, hopefully, our podcast will continue to get better as we continue to invest in better technologies, as I learn to speak more clearly into a microphone and all of the other things that can improve the podcast. But I don't know that we can ever get a better, clearer, and more fun picture of this epic series than looking at it through Matt Cawthon's perspective, because it has been enlightening to me and I've truly enjoyed it. I hope all of our listeners have enjoyed Season 2. I know we certainly have. And after a brief break, I hope you'll all join us for Season 3.
And subscribe to Wheel of Mind on Podbean, Stitcher, Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, and that last one is under the name Lajara Dane, to get notified when a new episode drops every Wednesday. Leave us feedback by rating and reviewing on your preferred podcast listening platform, or by contacting us through email at lajaradane@gmail.com, or on Twitter at mind_wheel, or you can reach me personally at Lajara Sedai on Twitter, that's Sedai. And to support the show for just $3 a month and get access to a couple little perks, you can visit our Patreon at patreon.com/wheelofmind. It was about a hero who insisted with every breath that he was anything but a hero. This is not the ending to the turning of the Wheel of Mind, but it is an ending. Also, rest in peace, Adobe Flash Player. That's totally unrelated, but I'll stick it in an after show.